Denise Allen with PA Ancestors, and I'm excited to welcome back Jim Beidler to the podcast. He's going to give us some great insights on how to use all those newspapers that we have access to help in researching our ancestors. He wrote a book called The Family Tree Historical Newspaper Guide. There's a link in the show notes. You'll want to check it out so you can purchase it and really dig in to something that we can access from home anytime, sometimes with a subscription, but definitely it's something that'll give us some serious history and context for our ancestors' lives. If you are looking for a way to connect with other genealogists, also doing Pennsylvania research, also using newspapers, and lots of other resources around Pennsylvania, I am opening up a special online area for Pennsylvania researchers. So if you're researching in Pennsylvania, you have a lot of family here, particularly early family back in the 1800s, the 1700s, you're going to want to join this group. We're going to hang out together this winter. We're going to do some brick wall busting, some Ask Me Anythings, some meeting of the mind, swapping of resources. Maybe there'll even be people there that share some of the same surnames that you have that you're researching, and you can combine efforts. Look below in the show notes or in the description on YouTube for a link to get more information. It'll take you to a special page I have set up where it has a little introductory video, and it'll just tell you a little bit about it, and you can drop your email address in there. And then when I open up the group, you'll be the first to know and get a special offer in terms of joining. Jim is here right now to share with us about newspapers, and I can't wait for you to hear what he has to say. And I would love if you have something that you found through a newspaper to drop it in the comments. Jim's going to be watching this video, and he's going to love to hear too what you found out using some of his techniques. So here's Jim Beidler. Jim Beidler, I want to welcome you back to the podcast. I'm so excited we get to connect again. This is the maybe plus side of the shutdowns and everything. We get to keep doing these interviews, but we're going to talk today about your newspaper book, which I was so excited about. It's the Family Tree Historical Newspaper Guide.
Yep.
And what made you want to write this book?
Well, that's the easy question to answer. I was a first career newspaper copy editor. As I sometimes snark, back when newspapers had copy editors. But yeah, that was my from college on to age 39 at a couple of different newspapers, and one of the things that I did for several years was be the paginator of the obituary page, where I was placing the obituaries down in the sequence that they would appear. So that this is kind of a melding of my first career and then my interest in genealogy.
Oh, wonderful. I picked up the book, and I honestly expected it at first glance to be a list of these are the newspaper databases that you need to look at online, and these are the major newspapers you should look at. And here's some quick tips on how to search these newspapers. And it's not that. It's totally not that. It's a methodology book on how to use newspapers. So why do family historians need to know the method of newspaper research versus quick tips?
Yes. Well, the whole thing is, I've heard too many times before I wrote the book, and then as I had the book available for sale, someone saying, when I say about newspapers, their response is, "Oh, I have my ancestor's obituary," as if that is the only thing that a newspaper might possibly provide. And so in many ways, this book was written to show that if you do it properly, your ancestors' demise, their ending point, might be your starting point for newspaper genealogy, but it shouldn't be your ending point for the research. Because even thinking about just death records themselves, the obituary maybe one of only a half a dozen different newspaper mentions of death, let alone other things like church burial records, their tombstone, etc. But in newspapers, in addition to their obituary, there might be a separate death notice. That those were traditionally, obituaries used to be free. Yeah, I go back a while in this game. Now mostly they are paid too, but there used to be paid death notices where you could say whatever you want, usually replaced by the undertaker, the funeral director. If there was any question about how your ancestor died, there often the newspaper would report on an inquest and how the coroner ruled on that. And a settlement of estate after death. A lot of times those traditionally would be published and may list the actual date of death as part of the preface to things. So that's why I'm saying there's so many different, and even obituaries themselves. Okay, you got one obituary. Well, what if there were 3 newspapers in town? You should be trying all those newspapers. What if they were an immigrant? You should be trying see if there's a foreign language newspaper, not necessarily in that city, because a lot of times they covered wider geographic areas, but to see if that mention is, because a lot of times what we find, as is natural with foreign language speaking immigrants, it's going to be more authentically presented, their name, the place name of their origins in the native tongue than in an English language newspaper.
That is so true. That wide reaching impact. I once was researching for someone, she died, the ancestor died at 107.
Oh.
And what a great obituary, right? That would make. Well, the edition of the newspaper that it would have been in, it was a weekly newspaper, is missing, right? It's not been digitized. It doesn't exist. But she was so exceptional, dying at 107 and having so many like great grandchildren and everything. It was picked up in several other newspapers, right?
Yes.
It wasn't a full obituary, but it went far. Like it went out of state. And and I was able to give this person something about their ancestor. It wasn't ideally what I would want, I mean, I would really want that newspaper to exist, but
sure, but something's better than nothing.
Yeah, but a woman, she didn't leave an estate, and it was fabulous that to think more broadly, people shared exceptional stories, something that stood out.
Or even not necessarily exceptional. Another thing I say is that if you have ancestors that were on the move, you should be tracing a trail of breadcrumbs backwards from where they died to where they were born, because when they do die, each stop along the way, there may be something published. Maybe like you're saying, not a full obituary, but some mention that will give you some insight or some information.
Yeah. So that whole like so-and-so who was from here died in, whatever place, far-flung Ohio. It's all the way over there for people from Pennsylvania. But so the other thing I wanted to ask you about, let me look at the questions here. So here's the other question kind of related to that. So what are genealogists missing out on if all they're doing is typing their ancestor's name into that search box that we love the search box in genealogy. It's so convenient. But if we're only typing in that person's name and then looking at the results, what are we missing out on in our newspaper search?
Yeah, well, potentially you're missing out on most of the mentions. Because you may remember the cliche that newspapers are the rough draft of history. Well, one of the ways they're a very rough draft, especially when you go back to the hard type, linotype days, where it was not easy to make of errors in newspapers, you get all sorts of misspellings of names, all sorts of data that ends up being wrong. Well, if you're only putting in one spelling of the surname for your ancestor, a lot of times you're going to miss some good things. And likewise, if it's a very common name, you're going to get too many hits to process. And that's when we recommend, most of the newspaper search sites will have an advanced search where you can say, say the name is Jones. Okay, you put Jones in there, but then you also put, search for pages that have both Jones and Carpenter, if that's their occupation, or an address that that they lived at. That may help narrow it down to your particular Jones.
Oh, very good. I used the address trick the one time and found out who had been living in that rental property. Like, it ended up being that the property somebody lived at, they had been renting, which I didn't quite realize from the census. I mean, that the census year I used didn't tell me if they were renting.
Didn't even list that
in Philadelphia. Yeah, and it was interesting. Sort of, there was a whole series of unfortunate events that had happened at that same address, the decade before. And I was like, oh, this is like a sketchy part of town. It's the conclusion I got from reading that newspaper. And it gave me a whole different picture of this person I was researching. Oh, they live in a sketchy part of town, where there were murders and robberies and all kinds of things.
Oh, it's not just actual misspellings in the newspaper, but then also the way. What makes these historical newspapers searchable now is OCR, optical character recognition technology, which builds a skin over the newspaper page of all the words as that OCR software has interpreted them. And it doesn't always interpret them right. I have a marriage of an ancestor that I knew I'd found it in a newspaper at one point. It was a pastor reporting his marriages to the newspaper, and it was one that he didn't put them in any congregation's church book, so it was going to be the only record of it. And then I tried finding that later by looking at what I knew were the names. And it wasn't coming up because the OCR was defective. And because I thought, oh, I'm ahead of the game here. My ancestor's name was Amos, like the Old Testament prophet. But I remembered that the pastor had used an odd but phonetic spelling, Emaus, which is still Amos in German phonetics. But when I put into the OCR Emaus, it wasn't coming up. And as I remember, it had interpreted it as ENIIUS. So again, don't, be very creative with what you get.
That's super frustrating because that OCR is reading it separately each time you search it. It's not like searching a regular database where things have names and the names are consistent. So you're searching against those names or those words all the time. But the OCR's technology is rereading the newspaper every time it's searched. It's re-looking at it. It's not great. I mean, it's better. It's better than
it's better than the old rabbit hole when you'd look at them on microfilm.
It's better than microfilm,
and better and maybe not make it out of the newspaper after a day.
Your book, The Family Tree Historical Newspaper Guide, has advice that applies for anyone. It's not just Pennsylvania researchers. It's anywhere in the United States, and you can probably take a lot of what you learn in this book to search international newspapers. If you're searching your European ancestors in particular, where there were a lot of newspapers before they came here. But do you have advice specific for Pennsylvania researchers? Because I know you personally spend a lot of time researching in Pennsylvania. So what do Pennsylvania people need to keep in mind with our newspapers?
Well, the first thing you need to keep in mind is the sheer volume of the number of newspapers produced in Pennsylvania. When they began the U.S. newspaper project back in the late 70s, when that was a microfilm project to try to preserve these acid paper newspapers that were literally crumbling. I believe they went into that thinking, there's probably about 2,000 different newspapers during Pennsylvania's history. They got almost 9,000. Yeah. Now, not all of that. There are some for which no issues are extant. That they simply were not saved, or they had a very short life as a newspaper. Maybe weren't well funded or whatever. But that's the first thing is again, going back to that you should be looking at more than one newspaper. Because virtually every county seat had more than one newspaper at a time. And the way you want to access them, and this is in the book, is through the U.S. newspaper directory on Chronicling America. That should be your starting point, rather than, what's newspapers.com have? What's genealogybank.com have? What's newspaperarchive.com? You're going to get to all of those, but start with Chronicling America, and specifically the U.S. newspaper directory. That's my best advice. And the thing you'll encounter, this is not necessarily unique to Pennsylvania, but it's certainly something you encounter in Pennsylvania research, are, along with that very vibrant newspaper history, frequent changes of nameplates of newspapers. This is important only because you're thinking, a certain newspaper doesn't exist before a certain date. Well, it may very well be that it does, but it was under a different name. Maybe it changed ownership or editorship, and they wanted a new slant on things. And sometimes the name changes are fairly subtle. They add the word daily to the title or whatever, but that counts as a new nameplate a lot of times, especially depending on how libraries, repositories, and websites, how well they catalog what they have.
Hmm. Good advice. I mean, 2,000 to 9,000 newspapers, and you give advice in the book about how to find those newspapers. So Chronicling America's website, which is run by the Library of Congress, is the place to start. But would you suggest also, like, historical societies, sometimes those microfilm their local newspapers?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And now most of them now are getting grants to digitize their newspapers. But that's led a little bit to what we call it, the orphan papers problem. If a newspaper was never microfilmed to begin with, a lot of times now it's not being digitized either, because they've pretty much perfected the microfilm to digital transfer. This is why Family Search, 11 years ago, when they started digitizing all of the family history library microfilms, they said it would take 100 years. And within a few years, they were saying, oh, yeah, we're going to have it done in a decade, because the technology speeded up so fast. So there are still newspapers that are only available in the original paper form. And those, like you're saying, may be at a county historical society, or maybe at the State Library of Pennsylvania. They have some ones that are paper only. But yeah, there's a whole chapter in the book about, here's your checklist of all possible newspaper type assets. Things like, abstracts that Genealogical Society volunteers have done over the years. Well, in some cases, those abstracts, they were done when the newspaper was still extant. Now it may not be. So that may be the only source for that. And even, again, Historical and Genealogical Society journals that may have done abstracts from newspapers. Yeah. So there's a lot of different, or clipping files that historical societies have, clipping files by subject or by family name. Yeah, there's a whole lot of different newspaper resources out there, and you've got to make sure that you're giving yourself the full chance to avail yourself of all of them.
Oh, such great advice. And that was one of my favorite parts of the book is um when I had to keep resisting stopping my reading to run and go do research because I was like, oh, that's a great idea. So I was ready to go. But you did have checklists at the end of each chapter. Like, keep
Yes.
this in mind, keep this in mind,
Yep.
here. And I could use those easily to really change my whole method of using newspapers. And you do my favorite thing, which is to really encourage genealogists to just put themselves in the time and the place of their ancestors and not just keep their contemporary brain on typing into that search box. Like, really sink in, really read that newspaper and just go deeper into your ancestors' life and their community through that. So
I talk about fighting presentism. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
did. You did. It was one of my favorite words. I was like, I was so excited. I, I think I think with genealogy, I guess with like a lot of fields, people have different approaches, and our approaches seem a little like much in sync, like really,
Yes.
where at least half our brain is stuck in, the 1800s or the 1700s half the day. We're clopping along on the horse, going to church, or something, imagining how our ancestors, living their life. And then we're back into our computers and talking on Zoom. But, it's this weird life we lead. Jim, what else did you want to tell us about your book or newspapers? Did I leave anything out?
I think we've hit the highlights, but
Okay.
certainly it was a work of love as a tribute to my first career. And also, unlike my first two German books, where what was then Family Tree Books had come to me with basically the title and even the outline of things, this is one I pitched to them because just as you were saying, the lists of newspapers or a few tips books, they had been done. I wanted a comprehensive, view of this whole record group and how to research it. And I thank the editors there that they allowed me to do that.
Well, we are really lucky that you did it, that you combined your past profession and genealogy into such a book. It's an absolutely must recommend. If you're a genealogist, home these days because of the, wanting to stay safe or just lockdowns or whatever, the Family Tree Historical Newspaper Guide will have you completely redoing all your newspaper research and giving you a whole new light on your ancestors and probably breaking some brick walls. Although Jim will not back that up with the money back guarantee.
No, there is no guarantee in genealogy.
Do not contact him if you didn't break down a brick wall. But no, you can definitely get deeper into your ancestors' lives and enrich the research that you've already done, which is what we always want to do. So, Jim, thank you so much for writing it. And I hope you write another book. Will you write another?
I'm definitely working on second editions to my current oeuvre. Whether there'll be an entirely new one, that's going to depend on whether I find a topic that I think has not been done before.
Thank you again for being on the podcast.
You're welcome, and thank you.